Mark Thompson was the kind of guy who appreciated the simple pleasures in life. Every morning, before the neighborhood buzzed awake, he'd step out into his backyard, grab his fishing rod, and settle by the small pond that sat quietly at the edge of his property. That pond was his sanctuary, a little slice of peace carved out in the middle of a busy suburban development in Ohio. Fishing wasn't just a hobby for Mark, it was therapy. A moment where time slowed down, the noise faded away, and all that mattered was the gentle tug on the line, the soft ripple of water, and the hope of a good catch. His neighbors often joked that Mark's pond was his secret treasure, though most of them barely gave it a second glance. But that quiet morning, routine was about to get disrupted in a way Mark never saw coming. It started on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. Mark was just about to cast his line when he noticed a figure walking briskly toward him from across the street, a woman with determination in her eyes and a clipboard in hand. It was Karen Mitchell, the chairwoman of the HOA board. Now, Karen wasn't just any HOA member. She had a reputation in the neighborhood, someone who took rules seriously, maybe a little too seriously. Neighbors whispered about her no-nonsense attitude and how she'd been known to wield the HOA guidelines like a weapon. And today, Mark was about to find out just how serious she could be. Karen stopped right at the edge of Mark's pond, her expression unreadable but firm. She cleared her throat and pulled a folded letter from her clipboard, holding it out like it was a summons from the courthouse. "Mark," she said, her voice steady but with an unmistakable edge. "You're violating HOA regulations. This letter is a formal notice, sir. $2,000 fine for fishing in your backyard pond." Mark blinked. He looked at the letter, then back at Karen. "Fishing. But I didn't know fishing was against the rules." Karen gave a tight smile, clearly expecting this. "It's in the community guidelines. Section 12. Subsection 4. Fishing and use of the pond for recreational activities is prohibited without prior approval from the HOA board." Mark's mind raced. He'd read those community guidelines several times, in fact, and had never come across any rule banning fishing in the pond on his property. It was his backyard, after all. How could they tell him what to do there? "I think there's been a mistake," Mark said carefully. "I've lived here for 5 years. Nobody ever mentioned this. And I've fished here plenty of times without any issues." Karen's eyes narrowed. Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse. The fine must be paid within 30 days, or further action will be taken. Mark felt a knot tighten in his stomach. $2,000. That was more than a month's rent for some people. For him, it wasn't pocket change either. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more it felt like this wasn't really about the rules. Something else was going on. As Karen turned to leave, Mark called out, "Is there any way to appeal this? To discuss it?" Karen paused but didn't turn back. "The board's decision is final." With that, she walked off down the street, clipboard tucked under her arm, leaving Mark standing, alone by his pond, feeling more bewildered than ever. That day, the peaceful rhythm of Mark's mornings shattered. The pond no longer felt like a refuge, it felt like a battleground. And Mark realized that what started as a small fine was about to spiral into something much bigger. But he wasn't going to let it go without a fight. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind for Mark. The quiet mornings spent by his pond fishing were replaced with hours of pacing, rereading that letter from Karen, and searching through every page of the HOA handbook he could find. Mark needed to understand exactly what he was up against. And here's the thing, no matter how hard he looked, the rule Karen cited just wasn't there. Or at least, not in the way she described it. The HOA handbook was a thick binder, full of bylaws, regulations, and guidelines that sometimes felt more complicated than legal contracts. Mark had skimmed through it when he first moved in, but now he was reading it with a fine-tooth comb. Fishing wasn't mentioned in any of the usual places, no bans in the use of private property section, no restrictions in the outdoor activities, guidelines. The only mention of the pond was a vague note about preserving natural areas and keeping the neighborhood looking nice. There was no clear, no fishing rule. Frustration grew inside Mark. Had Karen made this up, or maybe she had misunderstood something? But why would she suddenly come down so hard with a $2,000 fine? Something so serious it could ruin his peace of mind. Mark wasn't the kind of guy to back down easily, but he also wasn't a fighter by nature. He just wanted to enjoy his pond. But this felt different. This felt personal. So he started talking to neighbors. Some shared quiet nods of sympathy. Others lowered their voices to confide stories of their own. Run-ins with Karen, like the family who got fined for planting certain flowers in their front yard, or the elderly couple who had a dispute over holiday decorations. A pattern was emerging. Karen wasn't just a strict rule enforcer, she was a stickler who seemed to enjoy flexing her power. And it wasn't always clear that her decisions were backed by actual rules. Mark realized this wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about the dynamics of power in a small community, and the consequences when one person takes the rules into their own hands. Determined to find out the truth, Mark contacted the HOA board directly, requesting a formal meeting to discuss the fine. His letter was polite but firm. He attached a copy of the handbook pages he'd reviewed, asking for clarification on the supposed phishing ban. Days passed with no reply. Then an email from the HOA president arrived. It was brief, defensive, and dismissive. The board stands by the fine issued to you. Our community standards must be upheld. Further appeals will not be considered. That was a clear message. No discussion, no negotiation. Mark's frustration boiled over. He thought back to the day Karen had told him the board's decision was final. Now he knew this wasn't about rules or community standards. It was about control. For Mark, something had to change. He spent the next few evenings online, researching HOA laws in Ohio and reading up on homeowners' rights. What he found surprised him. While HOAs have broad powers, they are still bound by state laws that prevent them from enforcing rules, arbitrarily or unfairly. That knowledge felt like a lifeline. Mark realized he could challenge the fine not just by arguing the rule didn't exist, but by proving the HOA's action was unjust and potentially illegal. The problem? He didn't know how to start. That's when Mark reached out to a local attorney, specializing in HOA disputes. After explaining the situation and sending over all the documents, Mark was told there was definitely a case to be made. The fine could be challenged and there might even be grounds to hold Karen personally accountable if it turned out she had overstepped her authority. Mark felt a spark of hope, but Karen wasn't about to let this go quietly. Word spread quickly that Mark was stirring the pot. The next time Mark walked outside, he noticed a few neighbors giving him curious glances. Some whispered, others outright avoided him. The neighborhood was watching. Karen's quiet war on Mark was about to get loud. Mark knew the coming days would be a test, not just of his love for fishing, but of his willingness to stand up for himself and his rights. The peaceful man who once just wanted to enjoy his backyard pond was becoming something else, a man ready for a fight. And as the tension built, Mark couldn't help but wonder, just how far would Karen go to keep her grip on the neighborhood? After Mark had secured an attorney and began quietly preparing to fight the fine, Karen's behavior changed and, not in a way he expected. The first time he saw her after his lawyer got involved, she wasn't alone. She had two other board members, trailing behind her like backup. Their faces were serious, almost intimidating. Karen marched right up to Mark's front porch, clipboard in hand, her usual confident smile replaced by something sharper, almost like a warning. Mark, she said, voice low but clear, you need to reconsider your position on this fine. The board isn't going to back down, and if you proceed, there will be consequences. Mark raised an eyebrow. Consequences? Like what? Karen leaned in, lowering her voice to a near whisper. Legal fees, community restrictions, and trust me. You don't want to make an enemy of the HOA. Mark's heart pounded, but he didn't show it. I'm just standing up for what's right. If you think a fishing fine is going to scare me, you're wrong. Karen's eyes narrowed. Watch yourself, Mark. And with that, she turned on her heel. The other two board members, following close behind. Mark stood frozen for a moment, the tension thick in the air. That day marked a turning point. The friendly neighborhood disputes had become something much more serious. It was clear Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was wielding her position like a weapon. But instead of backing down, Mark felt a fire ignite inside him. This wasn't about fishing anymore. It was about standing up to an unfair system and fighting for fairness in his own backyard. Narrator.com. Thoughtful that evening, Mark sat at his kitchen table, the fine letter lying between him and his laptop. He reread Karen's threats over and over, trying to stay focused. He opened his email to see messages from neighbors, some expressing support, others warning him to be careful. One message stood out. Karen's been like this for years, the sender wrote. She thinks she's above the rules. You're not alone, but she can get nasty. Stay strong. Mark leaned back in his chair, realizing this battle wasn't just his. It was something bigger, something many in the neighborhood had quietly endured. Narrator building suspense over the next few days. Mark noticed subtle changes around the community. The neighborhood Facebook group became a battlefield. Posts appeared accusing him of trying to disrupt the peace or stir trouble. Some neighbors who had once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact. Karen's influence was real, and she was using it. Then, one afternoon, Mark's mailbox held another surprise, a second letter from the HOA. This one was even more ominous. Due to your ongoing non-compliance, it read, the board has voted to restrict your access to community amenities, including the clubhouse and pool, effective immediately. Further violations may result in additional fines. Mark stared at the letter, disbelief creeping in. Finding him $2,000 wasn't enough now. She wanted to isolate him from the community. That's when Mark realized Karen's strategy was clear. Make an example out of him so no one else would dare challenge her. But the more she pushed, the more Mark's resolve hardened. Narrator, voice firm. Determined, Mark knew this was a fight that couldn't be won with anger alone. He needed to be smart. He contacted his attorney again and mapped out the next steps. They'd gather evidence, collect testimonies from neighbors who had been similarly targeted, and prepare to expose the HOA's overreach in court. Mark also started documenting everything: the letters, the meetings, the subtle intimidation, every threat, every warning, every unfair action would be recorded and used to hold the HOA accountable. Narrator with a touch of humor, meanwhile, Mark's fishing rod sat unused in the corner of his garage. The peaceful days by the pond felt like a distant memory, but if there was one thing he learned, it was this. Fighting an HOA Karen was like wrestling a giant cat. You had to be careful, patient, and never underestimate the claws. And Mark was ready. Narrator closing the part with suspense. What Karen didn't expect was that Mark wasn't just a hobby fisherman. He was a man who knew when to stand up, when to push back, and when to fight. The question now was, how far would Karen go to silence him? And how much was Mark willing to risk for the right to fish in his own backyard? The battle lines were drawn, and the neighborhood was about to witness a showdown that would change everything. Mark knew the fight ahead wasn't just about stubbornness. It was about understanding the fine print, the hidden details, and the legal ground beneath his feet. He couldn't rely on gut feelings or neighborhood gossip anymore. If he wanted to win, he needed proof. So he went back to the HOA handbook, this time armed with a legal mind and a determination that surprised even himself. Night after night, Mark pored over the pages, highlighting everything that might relate to the pond, outdoor activities, and fines. His attorney had told him, if the rules aren't clear, the HOA doesn't have a leg to stand on. But Mark needed more than that. He wanted to find the exact wording Karen had twisted or, if no such rule existed, expose it. It wasn't easy. The handbook was a maze of legal jargon, vague phrases, and contradictory clauses. Some rules were clear, others frustratingly vague, and the sections about community spaces were scattered across different chapters. One thing was glaring. Nowhere did it say fishing was banned outright. There were notes about preserving wildlife and preventing pollution, but nothing explicitly forbade casting a line in a private backyard pond. Mark even found a section that talked about the possibility of recreational activities in community spaces, suggesting some flexibility. Something didn't add up. Narrator. Voice dropped slightly, adding tension. What shocked Mark even more was a little known clause buried deep in the handbook, one that stated the HOA board members must not enforce rules arbitrarily or outside their authority. If a rule was unclear or not existent, the board had no right to issue fines. That was the key. If Karen had issued a $2,000 fine for a rule that didn't exist or worse, one she made up, she could be held personally liable for damages. Mark's mind raced. He wasn't just offending himself. He was staring down the possibility that Karen had abused her power. Narrator with a hint of disbelief. But why? Why would Karen, a well-respected figure on the HOA board, take such a risky gamble? Mark decided to dig deeper. He started talking to longtime residents, gathering stories and memories. One neighbor recalled a heated board meeting from 2 years earlier where Karen had pushed for stricter community standards after a minor dispute over landscaping. Some thought she wanted more control over what people did in their yards. Another mentioned Karen's tendency to find neighbors who disagreed with her or refused to follow unwritten neighborhood rules. It became clear. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was shaping them to fit her own agenda. Mark realized the fight wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of overreach, intimidation, and misuse of authority. Narrator voice softer, reflective at the same time. Mark was careful. He didn't want to make Karen an enemy he couldn't handle. He knew from those whispered warnings around the neighborhood that Karen had a reputation for being relentless and, at times, vindictive. But Mark was ready to face whatever came next. He compiled his findings into a neat file, copies of the handbook pages, recorded conversations, with permission, and written statements from neighbors. His attorney advised him to keep everything organized, because once the battle reached the courtroom, every detail would matter. Narrator pacing slows. Building suspense, then came a surprising message from another HOA board member, quiet, middle-aged woman named Lisa, who had been watching the whole situation unfold. Lisa reached out with a simple but powerful offer. Mark, I think you're right. Karen's gone too far. If you want, I can help bring this to the rest of the board. Mark felt a flicker of hope. Behind the scenes, not everyone supported Karen's hardline approach. With Lisa's support, Mark was gaining allies. But the bigger question loomed. Would the HOA board stand up to Karen, or would they back her, risking the fallout? Narrator voice rises. Preparing for climax. Mark's preparations were almost complete. His case was stronger than he'd hoped, and the support from the community was growing quietly but steadily. What started as a simple fine for fishing was now becoming a battle over power, fairness, and the very rules that held the neighborhood together. And Karen, she was watching, waiting, planning her next move. Because in this fight, there was more at stake than just a backyard pond. Narrator closing the part with suspense. What will happen when Mark finally challenges the HOA board and Karen head on? Will justice prevail, or will Karen's grip tighten even further? One thing's for sure, Mark's quiet life is about to change forever. Stay with us for the next chapter. This story is far from over. The day Mark had both dreaded and anticipated finally arrived. The courthouse, usually a quiet building filled with the shuffling of papers and murmurs of legal talk, was now a stage for a drama that had rippled through a whole neighborhood. Mark sat in the waiting room, his heart pounding in rhythm with the distant ticking of the clock. His attorney sat beside him, calm and focused, reviewing the stack of documents, letters, and evidence they'd gathered over weeks of relentless preparation. The fine, the HOA handbook, the emails, the witness statements, all of it would soon be laid bare in front of the judge. Mark's mind drifted back to that first morning when Karen had come storming to his pond with the $2,000 fine letter in hand. Back then, he'd felt powerless and confused. Now, sitting in this courtroom, he felt something else determined. Ready, narrator? Building tension inside the courtroom, Karen sat stiffly, her usual confident demeanor replaced with a carefully composed mask. She was flanked by two board members, her allies in this battle to uphold the HOA's position. Her eyes briefly met Mark's across the room. A flicker of something was it doubt, passing through before she quickly looked away. The judge entered, a middle-aged woman with an air of authority and keen eyes that seemed to take in every detail in an instant. She settled behind her bench and called the court to order. Mark's attorney stood first, beginning with a clear, calm explanation of the case. How Mark had been unfairly fined $2,000 for fishing in his own backyard pond. Despite the failure to show any legitimate rule forbidding such an activity, he highlighted the vagueness and contradictions in the HOA handbook and accused the board, and Karen specifically, of abusing their authority. Narrator voice lowers slightly. Tension rising, Karen's attorney rose next, painting a very different picture. They claimed Karen was simply enforcing community standards that were necessary to maintain property values and neighborhood harmony. According to their argument, the fishing fine was a justified measure to prevent unauthorized use of shared spaces, if, in reality, Mark's pond was on his own property. It was a battle of narratives, a man fighting for his rights versus a board wielding rules to keep control. The courtroom was silent as the judge listened to both sides, occasionally asking pointed questions about the specifics of the HOA handbook and the authority of the board. Narrator with a note of suspense. The real turning point came when Mark's attorney presented the evidence of Karen's personal involvement in enforcing rules that didn't exist, and testimonies from neighbors who described similar, questionable fines and threats. It was clear Karen's strict enforcement wasn't isolated, it was a pattern. At one point, Karen's confident posture wavered. A witness described how Karen had personally pressured residents to comply with rules she'd apparently interpreted on her own terms. The judge's expression was unreadable, but the courtroom felt the tension rise like a storm brewing on the horizon. Narrator.com, but dramatic after hours of arguments and testimonies. The judge finally recessed the court for deliberation. Mark sat quietly, trying not to let anxiety consume him. This was more than a case about fishing. It was about fairness, accountability, and how power can be misused in communities like his. Outside, news had spread through the neighborhood. People whispered in cafes, exchanged messages online, wondering how this David Ungaloth story would end. Would Karen's grip on the neighborhood remain unchallenged, or would Mark's fight inspire change? Narrator, closing with suspense as the judge prepared to announce her verdict. The room held its breath. What would the decision be? The answer would not only decide Mark's fate, but potentially shake the very foundation of the HOA's power. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence. As the judge returned from her chambers, the tension was palpable. Mark could feel every eye in the room, locked on the bench, waiting for the words that could change everything. The judge cleared her throat, glanced briefly at the papers in front of her, and then looked up. This case, she began slowly, raises important questions about the balance between community governance and individual rights. Mark's heart pounded as she continued. After reviewing the evidence, it is clear that the Homeowners Association overstepped its authority in issuing the $2,000 fine to Mr. Thompson. The specific rule cited by the HOA does not explicitly prohibit fishing in a privately owned backyard pond, and the enforcement actions taken by the board, specifically by Ms. Mitchell, were arbitrary and unsupported by the community's governing documents. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge's gaze sharpened. Furthermore, the board's actions have caused undue financial and emotional hardship to Mr. Thompson. Therefore, the fine is hereby nullified, and the HOA is ordered to reimburse Mr. Thompson for all legal fees incurred in this matter. Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Narrator, voice rising with excitement, but the judge wasn't finished. In addition, she said, due to evidence suggesting misuse of authority and intimidation tactics by board members, a formal review of the HOA's governance practices is to be conducted. This review will include an examination of the conduct of Ms. Mitchell and the board's enforcement procedures. The courtroom erupted quietly. Whispers and exchanged glances filled the air. This was bigger than anyone expected. Karen sat frozen, her face a mask of controlled shock. The power she had wielded so confidently was now crumbling. Tone reflective, with a touch of humor outside the courthouse, the news spread fast. Neighbors who had been quietly watching from the sidelines started to come forward, sharing their own stories of unfair fines and overbearing rules. Mark found himself at the center of a community conversation he never asked for but now embraced. People who had been silent for years began to speak up, demanding transparency and fairness from their HOA. And Karen, well, let's just say her days of ruling the neighborhood with an iron clipboard were numbered. Narrator.com, closing. With suspense, as Mark packed up his things and stepped outside, a reporter from the local news approached him, microphone in hand. Mark, how does it feel to win this case? Mark smiled, a little weary but triumphant. It feels like justice finally caught up with the neighborhood. I just hope this sends a message that no one is above the rules, and no one should be bullied for enjoying their own home. But even as the victory sank in, Mark knew this was only the beginning. The HOA review was coming, Karen's response was unpredictable, and the neighborhood was watching. The question remained, what would happen next? With the judge's ruling fresh in the community's memory, the HOA was forced to act. The formal review of the board's governance practices was underway, and it quickly became clear that this was no simple bureaucratic process. It was a reckoning. Mark watched closely as the HOA convened a special meeting, one filled with whispers, tension, and a sense that the neighborhood was standing at a crossroads. The first thing that struck Mark was the divided room. On one side were the longtime supporters of Karen neighbors who valued the strict rules and the order she'd imposed. On the other side were those who had quietly suffered under her watch and now felt emboldened to speak up. Narrator, building. Suspense. The review committee, made up of both board members and independent community volunteers, started by examining complaints, not only about the fishing fine, but other instances where rules had been enforced harshly or inconsistently. Mark's attorney attended, along with Lisa, the board member who had reached out to Mark earlier. Lisa proved a surprising ally, speaking openly about how Karen's leadership style had created fear and division, rather than harmony. But Karen wasn't silent. In fact, she showed up at the meeting with an unexpected burst of defiance. Standing before the crowd, clipboard in hand, Karen defended her actions fiercely. I was only doing my duty to protect the community standards, she said. If we allow exceptions, chaos will follow. We must maintain order. The room was tense, the division palpable. Narrator with drama. What followed was a series of emotional testimonies. Neighbors shared stories of fines for minor infractions, threats to report residents to collection agencies, and the chilling effect Karen's leadership had on the community spirit. One elderly couple described how Karen's actions had prevented them from planting flowers outside their home, a small act that had brought them joy. Another young family talked about how they'd been warned to remove a simple garden statue. Mark listened, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that others had faced similar struggles. Sadness for how much fear had been sown. Narrator, subtle humor, and through it all, Mark couldn't help but notice the irony. Here he was, the fishing guy, who had unwittingly become the neighborhood's unlikely hero. He never wanted this fight, but now it seemed like he'd cast a line that reeled in much bigger issues. Narrator tone shifts to suspense. As the meeting stretched on late into the evening, the committee announced a series of recommendations. A thorough overhaul of the HOA enforcement policies to ensure transparency and fairness. Mandatory training for board members on legal boundaries and homeowner rights. Establishment of an independent complaint resolution panel to handle disputes. And, most importantly, a formal reprimand of Karen for her misuse of authority and the creation of a hostile environment. Karen sat silent, her usual confidence shaken but not broken. Narrator, closing the part with intrigue, but the fallout didn't stop there. Word spread fast, and suddenly Karen found herself isolated by many who had once stood behind her. Yet in the shadows, a faction of supporters began to plot, concerned that the changes threatened their vision of the neighborhood. Rumors whispered of attempts to call special board elections, to reclaim power, and to challenge the review's findings. Mark realized this battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The community was awakening, but old alliances and new rivalries meant the coming months would be a test of strength, unity and courage. Narrator, cliffhanger. What new battles lie ahead for Mark and the neighborhood? Will fairness finally prevail, or will the old guard fight back harder than ever? The weeks following the HOA review felt like living in the eye of a storm. The neighborhood was buzzing, the air thick with anticipation and anxiety. Mark knew the victory in court was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, rebuilding trust, healing divisions, and making sure this wasn't just a moment, but a lasting change. Narrator voice steady, then rising with drama. One evening, as Mark sat by his pond with his fishing rod finally in hand, a knock came at the door. It was Lisa, the HOA board member who had become his unexpected ally. We need to talk, she said quietly. Lisa revealed something no one had expected. Karen was planning to appeal the judge's ruling. Not only that, she had rallied a group of neighbors determined to overturn the review's recommendations. It's going to get messy, Lisa warned. Mark felt a surge of frustration. After all the effort, the fight wasn't over. But he also knew retreat wasn't an option. Narrator tension builds. The community split deepened. Some rallied behind Karen, fearing too much change, too much upheaval. Others stood with Mark, hopeful for a fairer, kinder neighborhood. Neighborhood meetings grew heated, lines drawn sharply between old traditions and new beginnings. Mark's life, once quiet and centered on peaceful fishing, had become a public battleground. Narrator, dramatic pause. Then shift, but here's where the story took an unexpected turn. One afternoon, Karen showed up at Mark's door not with a fine or a threat, but with a peace offering. "I want to talk," she said, voice softer, almost hesitant. Mark was skeptical, but agreed. Narrator, softer, reflective tone. They sat on Mark's porch, the afternoon sun casting long shadows. Karen admitted she'd let her fear of losing control cloud her judgment. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood," she said. "But maybe I forgot what it's really about, people. Community." Mark listened carefully. He saw something genuine in her eyes, a flicker of regret. Narrator, with a touch of humor, they agreed to work together on a new vision for the HOA, one that balanced order with kindness, rules with fairness, and yes, Mark got his fishing back. Narrator, uplifting and conclusive months later. The neighborhood was different. The HOA board had changed policies, welcoming community input and transparency. Karen stayed on, but with a renewed commitment to fairness. And Mark, well, he became a symbol of courage and the unexpected power of one person standing up. Narrator, closing with warmth and a call to action. So what's the lesson here? Sometimes, fighting for what's right means facing off against powerful odds. Sometimes it means digging deep, standing tall, and casting your line into troubled waters. And sometimes, just sometimes, it means finding common ground even with your fiercest opponent. If you've ever felt bullied or silenced by rules that don't make sense, remember Mark's story. You have a voice. You have power. Don't be afraid to use it. Narrator, final call to action. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, share it with your neighbors, and subscribe for more real-life tales of courage and community. And hey, what would you do if an HOA tried to fine you $2,000 for fishing? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight, and keep fishing for justice.